The Wednesday Wars March. The news from Kazan that Walter Cronkite reported each night kept getting grimmer. The 5,000 Marines that were cut off and could get supplies only by air, even though any helicopter that flew over took a lot of enemy fire from the 20,000 surrounding Viet Cong troops. Meanwhile, the Marines were dug into bunkers covered with 3 feet of earth to protect them from the mortar shells that the Viet Cong were lobbing into the camp. About 500 mortar shells a day. And when they weren't lobbing shells, the Viet Cong were digging tunnels that they could use to put explosives beneath the Marines. Some reports said that the tunnels were only 100 yards away from the barbed wire around the Kazan base. The Marines had started to use the stethoscopes and divining rods to see if they could find them. You know things are bad when the United States Marine Corps is using stethoscopes and divining rods. Still, the White House announced that the enemy offensive was running out of steam. The casualties at Kazan were light, and that we would never give up the Marine base there. We watched Walter Cronkite together every night after supper now, even my sister. We were all quiet, and not just because my father would have hollered if anyone had interrupted Walter Cronkite. Sometimes, though, my father himself would shake his head and whisper, 5,000 boys trapped. Good Lord. 5,000. We'd watch the pictures of the Marines in their zigzagging trenches or deep in their bunkers, holding their hands over their ears inside their helmets because of the thunder of the mortar shells. Then my father would reach for my mother's hand and they would look at each other. My sister sat rigid with anger, I guess. She probably wanted to say something like, I told you so, or if President Johnson had listened and gotten us out of there in time, or no one in Washington knows what he's doing, but she didn't. When 500 mortar shells are coming in every day on top of soldiers huddled in holes with their hands over their ears, even a flower child who wanted nothing but world peace could only watch and hope. I also was watching the newscasts and hoping for a sign, any sign of Lieutenant Tybalt Baker. There never was one, not in any of the films of the mortars or the trenches or the downed and burning helicopters or the wounded. Walter Cronkite didn't read off the names of the missing in action, so Lieutenant Baker was never mentioned. But I still watched anyway, holding my breath, hoping. Which is what I think the whole town was doing. Which is certainly what Mrs. Baker was doing. But you would have never been able to tell that she was holding her breath at Camillo Junior High. She moved through our classroom as coolly as if Kazan were just a proper noun in a sentence that needed to be diagrammed. It was early spring and we were her garden, and she was starting to see the bulbs and seeds that she had planted last fall coming up. She raked away our dead leaves, spaded new soil around us, and watered and fertilized. And we grew fast and green, let me tell you. Especially Mai Tai, who was now the best sentence diagrammer in the 7th grade. Which may not sound like much, but with Mrs. Baker it was a big deal. During class it didn't seem as if anything was bothering Mrs. Baker at all. Except maybe the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, which now had about as much bulge as asbestos ceiling tiles can take. They looked like sails in full breeze. We still didn't know exactly what was making them so heavy. Maybe the rats were hoarding supplies for the summer drought up there. Maybe Sycorax and Caliban were just getting bigger and bigger. But whatever it was, no one wanted those tiles to come down with whatever was bulging them out. Not even Danny Hupfer. Which was why on the first Wednesday afternoon in March, while Mrs. Baker was grading, and I was at my desk starting in on Julius Caesar, who, let me tell you, was a whole lot smarter than Romeo, even though he ended up pretty badly too, Mr. Vindleri came in with a ladder, 8 new asbestos ceiling tiles, and a heavy mallet. Mrs. Baker looked at him. A mallet, she said. He brandished it in the air like Julius Caesar himself. You don't know how big a rat on the loose can get in 5 months, he said. Mrs. Baker looked up at the bulging ceiling tiles. I have some idea, she said. Mr. Vindleri set his ladder under one of the bulges. He steadied it and grabbed his mallet tightly in his right hand. He took 3 steps up the ladder, then with his left hand he slowly reached up to one of the bulging tiles. He tapped it a couple of times and we listened. Nothing. He pushed against it. Nothing. He hit it lightly with the mallet. Still nothing. He came back down the ladder and went over to the corner of the room. He picked up the trash can and came back to the foot of the ladder. I'll need someone to hold this underneath the tile when I take it off, just in case stuff comes out, he said. Just in case stuff comes out, said Mrs. Baker. That's right, said Mr. Vindleri. Mrs. Baker looked over at me. Sometimes I think she still hates my guts. So there I was, holding this trash can underneath the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, and Mr. Vindleri started to push up on one of them with his mallet. You won't catch the stuff standing over there, he said to me. I moved a little closer. Right here, he said, pointing to the target area. Then he turned and lifted one of the ceiling tiles with his mallet. We listened for the scrambling of 2 large rats. Nothing. So Mr. Vindlary tilted the tile to get it out, and shredded everything came pouring down. Homework announcements, PTA letters home, blue dittos, bazooka bubblegum wrappers, these were from Danny. Chewed up number 2 pencils, red and green and blue and yellow construction paper, napkins from the cafeteria, part of a black sneaker, this was from Doug Switek, who had been looking for it a couple of months. An odd picture of me leaping across stage in yellow tights, and scraps of Marilee's Mississippi River and You project. It all came down like wet snow. "Hold the trash under it," hollered Mr. Vindlary, which is exactly what I was doing, except that the stuff was also falling into my eyes and hair and down the back of my shirt. And I think I must have started screaming, because Mrs. Baker came and took the trash can from me. "Maybe you should find a different way to collect the refuse," she said to Mr. Vindlary, brushing the rat-chewed stuff off me. By the time Mr. Vindlary brought back a tarp, I had pretty much gotten my shaking under control. He handed me that mallet. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Swing at anything that has yellow teeth," he said. "Oh," I said quietly. I wasn't sure if that was better than having the rat-chewed stuff come down on my head. But even though I started to shake again, I held the mallet over my shoulder ready to strike, which you have to admit is not only brave and courageous, and true and blue and worthy of Jim Hawkins himself, but also pretty remarkable considering I still had rat-chewed stuff in my hair and down my back. But we never saw Sycorax or Caliban. Mr. Vindlary replaced the bulging ceiling tiles with 8 new ones, then stepped from the ladder and stood back. "Good as new," he said. "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Baker. "I'm sure," I willed him to say. "I'm sure, I'm sure, I'm sure." "I'm sure," said Mr. Vindlary. Then said Mrs. Baker to me, "You may return to Julius Caesar." But let me tell you, it's not easy to read a Shakespeare play when you've just been holding a mallet over your shoulder, ready to swing at anything that has yellow teeth. And Mr. Vindlary is still poking at the other tiles to see if they were bulging too, and knowing that any tile could come crashing to the floor along with Sycorax and Caliban, and they would not be happy, let me tell you. I wanted to read Julius Caesar standing on my desk, but that would definitely not have been worthy of Jim Hawkins. When he finally left, Mr. Vindlary told us he'd come check on the new asbestos ceiling tiles tomorrow. "Thank you," said Mrs. Baker. Then she went back to her grading. I wondered if she had wanted to stand on her desk too. Grading, by the way, is also something that makes it hard to read Shakespeare. When your teacher is covering papers with red ink a few desks away from you, and you know that yours is in the stack and it's probably coming up soon, and that your grasp of non-restrictive clauses might not be all that it should be, it's hard to read anything. Even though there was some good stuff in Julius Caesar. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. It doesn't have the cut of a Caliban curse, but it's all right. It also didn't help that Mrs. Baker kept wiping at her eyes during her grading. She told us that she'd had a terrible cold, but she hardly needed to tell us. Her eyes were mostly red all the time, and the way she blew her nose could be pretty impressive. Sometimes while sitting at her desk, she just stopped doing whatever she was doing and looked somewhere far away, like she wasn't even in the classroom anymore. It was a terrible cold, and day after day it kept on, and even seemed to be getting worse. Meryl Lee said that she was up to half a box of Kleenex per class, which has got to be some kind of a world record. So when she announced on Friday that members of the school board were coming to our room to observe and evaluate classroom performance by both students and their teacher, she told us in a soggy voice that drowned at the end. But drowning or not, she kept going. She was Mrs. Baker. "I will expect you all to be polite to the school board members. I will expect you to be on your very best behavior. I will expect you to show in an appropriate manner what you have been studying this school year." "When are they coming?" asked Meryl Lee. "Before I tell you what Mrs. Baker said, I have something else to tell you, because you won't believe what happened. Otherwise, if I don't. When Julius Caesar is coming into Rome, which is a place where very bad things will happen to him, this soothsayer comes up to him to tell him what's going to happen. And this is what he says to Julius Caesar. 'Beware the Ides of March.' So now I'll tell you what happened after Meryl Lee asked, 'When are they coming?' 'Beware the Ides of March,' I said. And Mrs. Baker looked at me, and her eyes opened a little bit, and without looking away from me, she said to Meryl Lee, 'A week from today, Miss Kowalski.' Which was the Ides of March. 'You are a soothsayer, Mr. Hoodhood,' said Mrs. Baker. 'Sometimes I scare even myself,' I said. 'Prophecy is not an unalloyed gift,' she said. 'Be careful how you use it.' Which is a teacher's strategy to get you to look up the word unalloyed. Which I did, and it still didn't make much sense. But what happened later that day was even weirder. In gym, Coach Cotrini announced that he was planning to form the Camillo Junior High cross-country team. It wouldn't be a regular team since cross country was a fall sport, but he wanted to start the 7th and 8th graders now so that he could choose a varsity team and have them run over the summer and be ready to be in real competition by September. He expected everybody to try out, everybody, and to get us started in our training, we would be running 2 miles at tempo. "What's at tempo?" I asked. "Race pace," he said. "How bad could that be?" I said to Danny. "Bad," Danny said. Coach Catrini had us stretch for 3 minutes, then do 4 short sprints down the length of the gym, and then stretch for another 2 minutes. Afterward, he took us to outside to the track, where there was pretty brisk March wind that cut right through my t-shirt. He put us at the starting line, held up his stopwatch, and blew his whistle. Danny was right. Race pace could be bad. I don't know how many times Coach Catrini used the word faster, but if a word can get worn out and die, this one sounded like Julius Caesar. This one died like Julius Caesar. He liked to add words to the front of faster. Words like a whole lot, and you can't go any, and you'd better get, and dang it. He also added words after faster, like you wimps, and you slugs, and you dang slugs, toward the end. It wouldn't have taken much for him to be able to play Caliban in the festival theater stage. Afterward, when we had all had our hands on our knees and were trying to suck some air into wherever it wasn't hurt that needed to get, he reminded us that we all had to try out for the varsity team, and promised that tryouts would be a whole lot harder than what we'd just done. Toads, beetles, bats. Now here's where the weird part comes. In my head jumped this sentence: tryouts will be in a week, on the Ides of March. And as soon as I thought it, Coach Catrini said, "Tryouts will be in a week, and you'd better be a whole lot faster than this, you dang wimpy slugs." I wondered if somewhere deep down within me I really was a soothsayer, even if only the first parts of the sentences were the same. I ran over the weekend, not because I was worried that Coach Catrini would think I was a dang wimpy slug, but because I was pretty sure that if I didn't, I might have something awful happen to me after running at tryout pace on the Ides of March. I ran 3 miles on Saturday and then 4 miles on Sunday afternoon. Even though it was the Sabbath and I deserved some time off. And actually, there was another reason for running over the weekend, an even better reason. My father was mad at my sister, which meant somehow that he was mad at me too. And it was better to be running with my lungs screaming for air than be in a house with my father screaming at me. Shh. And let me tell you, it wasn't for anything I'd done. Now that he had the new junior high school contract, my father needed to hire someone else in his office as a receptionist for weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings. And since he didn't want to pay anyone much for this, he decided that my sister should do it, and he would pay her $1.35 an hour and not take out any taxes. He announced this at supper on Friday night. "I can't," said my sister while passing the lima beans and not taking any. "Of course you can," said my father. "It's about time you started a real job." "I'm already working," said my sister. We looked at her. "Who for?" my father asked. "For Bobby Kennedy," she said. "For Bobby Kennedy," said my father. "Mr. Goldman is letting us use the back of his bakery for campaign headquarters." "Bobby Kennedy," said my father again. "Bobby Kennedy is a rich kid from Cape Cod who's never done anything on his own in his whole life. Bobby Kennedy will end the war, end the discrimination that's splitting our country in two, and end the control of the government by a handful of fat old men." My father, who was not fat and old yet, but who could probably imagine himself that way, started to get a little louder. Not a good sign. "You might as well go work for that Martin Luther King." "Maybe I will. He and Bobby Kennedy are the only ones who care that this country is about to explode." "He's a communist." "Oh, there's deep political analysis. He's leading a demonstration for striking sanitation workers, so he must be a communist." "Now you've got it," said my father. "You start work Monday afternoon." I think you can figure out how the rest of that conversation went, and how my mother and I didn't say much, and how we never did make it to dessert, which was a healthy thing for me to be running over the weekend, even though I hadn't done a thing. Still, I was glad that Bobby Kennedy was running for president. It was hard every night hearing President Johnson and all of the generals with medals spread over their chests say how well the war was going and how the enemy was about to give up, and then having CBS News cut to pictures of soldiers who were wading through rice paddles and holding their rifles high above the water, or who were carrying out a buddy whose face was covered with dry blood, or who were huddled in holes and covering their heads as tile mortars came over in Kazan. After that, you just wanted someone to say the plain truth, and maybe Bobby Kennedy would be that someone. I was glad he was running for president. And so maybe after all I had done something to make my father mad, just not out loud. At gym on Monday, Coach Catrini had us to run 3 miles, all at tempo. Let me tell you, after running for 2 miles and hearing, "Can't you go any faster, you dang wimpy slug," in your ears for most of it, you start to wonder if life is worth living. You still have 4 more times around the track, and the sky is turning darker, and the air is thinner, and you can't feel the ends of your fingers, and your legs are rock heavy, and there's something hurting deep down in your guts. Probably your liver is about to explode. But that doesn't matter so much because your lungs are drying out, and that hurts so much that nothing else can get your attention. "It'll be 5 miles on Friday," said Coach Catrini when we were finished. 5 miles on the Ides of March. On Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Baker asked how my cross-country preparation was going. "Death, a necessary end," I said, "will come when it will come." Mrs. Baker smiled. "Do you think that death is coming for you on the cross-country course, Mr. Hood? You know what happened to Julius Caesar on the Ides of March," I said. "Cross-country trouts will make that look like opening day at Yankee Stadium." "It's because you run so straight up," she said. "Because I run so straight up. And tight. You run so tight. I've watched you. It looks as if you're digging your fingernails into your palms." Which is exactly what I always did. "Are you saying I could run better?" She put down her copy of Julius Caesar. From her lower desk drawer, she took out a pair of bright white sneakers and put them on. "Caesar shall go forth," she said. "Where?" I asked. "Out to the track." "The 2 of us?" "Are you embarrassed that I might be faster than you?" she asked. "I'm not really worried about that, Mrs. Baker," I said. "Perhaps you should be," she said. "Look at what happened to Julius Caesar when he underestimated those around him." So we went out to the track with Mrs. Baker wearing bright white sneakers. "Really?" "Let's start with your stance," she said. "Let's lean you forward a little bit so that you can always be moving into the next stride. Instead of holding yourself back on each stride, lean this way." I did. "Run 50 paces and come back." I did. Again. I did. "At tempo," she said. I did. "That's fine. One could only wish that you took as easily to diagramming sentences. Now your arm position, and then your head position, and then we'll get to breathing patterns." By the end of the afternoon, Mrs. Baker had remade the way that I ran. "I look like a jerk," I said. "If Romeo was a runner, he would run like this." "What you look like," she said, "is Jesse Owens, who won 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympics running like that." So figuring that you can't argue with 4 gold medals, that night I ran like Jesse Owens through the dark March streets. Leaning forward, arms and legs like pistons, head straight and still, hands loose, breathing controlled. And then I ran like Jesse Owens in gym on Thursday and came in before Danny, and in front of a whole lot of 8th graders. And I heard only one, "Faster, you wimp, just one." Running like Jesse Owens really worked. So that afternoon, at the very end of the day, after everyone else had left, I went up to Mrs. Baker's desk. "A big day for us both tomorrow," said Mrs. Baker. "The Ides of March," I said. "Let's hope we both emerge unscathed," which, in case you missed it, was the teacher's strategy again to make me look up the word unscathed. "Mrs. Baker," I said, "you helped a lot with my running." "Thank you, Mr. Hood. So I thought I would try to pay you back." "Pay me back?" "Yes, to help you get ready for tomorrow when the school board comes." "You want to coach me in teaching, Mr. Hood?" "Yes." "Have you ever been a 7th grade English teacher?" "No, but you've never been a track runner." Mrs. Baker raised a single eyebrow. "So what do you suggest, Coach?" "No teacher jokes," I said. "No one ever laughs at teacher jokes." "All right, no teacher jokes. And no folding your arms like this." I folded my arms across my chest. "It makes it look like you're about to shoot us if we don't do what you say." "That is the point," said Mrs. Baker. "And no rolling your eyes, even if someone says something really stupid." "I never roll my eyes," said Mrs. Baker. I looked at her. "All right," she said. "No rolling my eyes. Anything else, Coach?" "When someone does something good, I think you should let them know with some sort of code." "I think you mean that when someone does something well, as in obeying the rules of proper diction, we should use a code. What do you suggest?" "Well, maybe azalea for something good, and chrysanthemum for something really good." "Thank you, Mr. Hood. We'll dispense with the code, and I'll simply use the unvarnished English language to tell you when you've done something well. But as to teacher jokes, folding of arms and rolling of eyes, I'll consider your advice." I nodded. "And Coach, one more thing before you leave," said Mrs. Baker. She reached into her lower desk drawer again and pulled out a wooden box. "Open it," she said. I did. Inside was a round silver disc on a velvet dark ribbon. "Olympiad, Melbourne, 1936, it said. 16th Olympiad. Mrs. Baker leaned back in her chair. It was for the women's 4x100 relay. Don't look so surprised. You didn't think I'd spent my whole life behind this desk, did you? And I suddenly realized that, well, I guess I had. Weren't all teachers born behind their desks, fully grown, with a red pen in their hand and ready to grade? Go home now, Mr. Hoodhood, said Mrs. Baker, and tomorrow run like Jesse Owens. The Ides of March dawned on a Friday with green and brown sky, the color of the water in a dying pond. All morning, the sky hung low, and sometimes the green and brown clouds would roll up and rumble a bit, and then settle back down like a layer of unhappiness over everything. We all talked in whispers, and we waited for something to happen up in heaven, or maybe up in the asbestos ceiling tiles. And since waiting gets boring really quickly, I decided that in the pause between non-restricted clauses and weak verb systems, I would tell Danny about the scene where Julius Caesar gets stabbed, which is a lot better than the scene where Juliet gets stabbed, and act it out with appropriate sound effects, which I do pretty well since I have some experience acting out Shakespeare on stage, as you might remember. I don't know if it was because of the green and brown sky, or because of her cold, or because of something else, but Mrs. Baker came over like Brutus himself to do Julius Caesar in. Mr. Hoodhood, she said, I have not taught you the plays of William Shakespeare for the last 5 months for you to demean them by acting as though they were all about people stabbing each other. I thought that was unfair. But they are, I said. They do it all the time. Macbeth kills Duncan, Macduff kills Macbeth, Brutus kills Julius Caesar, then Brutus kills himself, like when Juliet kills herself after Romeo kills himself, but not before Romeo kills Tybalt. And that's all you've learned from Shakespeare? I thought that was unfair, too. Mrs. Baker held out her hand. Give me the book, she said. I opened up my desk. Shakespeare is all about the power of goodness and honesty and faithfulness, she said. It is about the abundance of love. It is about the weakness of armies and battles and guns, and she stopped. Her mouth worked back and forth. It is about the endurance of love, she whispered. Give me the book. I handed it to her at the same moment that the classroom door opened, and Mr. Goreshi walked in, accompanied by Ms. Bradbrook and 2 other members of the school board. Mrs. Baker, said Mr. Goreshi. Mrs. Baker looked at him. Both of our hands were still on Shakespeare. Mrs. Baker, you know Mr. Bradbrook, of course, the chairman of the school board, and Mr. Smilzo, and you know Miss Sidman, who has just returned from Connecticut and been appointed to our school board. Mrs. Baker nodded to each one. How good to have you back, Mrs. Sidman, she said. Mrs. Sidman smiled. Her eyes darted around a little bit like she was expecting something awful to happen, but didn't want to show that she was expecting it. Mrs. Baker is one of our very finest teachers, said Mr. Goreshi. She will have a chance to show that to be true, said Mr. Bradbrook. He pointed to the book that Mrs. Baker and I were still holding. What are you giving to that young mind? He asked. Mrs. Baker looked at me, then looked back at Mr. Bradbrook. This is a volume of Shakespeare's plays, she said a little weakly. She let go of the book. Mr. Bradbrook came over to my desk and peered at the book. Then he took it from me and weighed it in his hands. He looked at the gilt edges and fingered the red ribbon tied at the spine. This seems like an awfully expensive volume for our schools to be purchasing, he said. It is my own copy, said Mrs. Baker. Mr. Bradbrook was relieved. He looked down at me. Young man, do you think you'll enjoy reading the master's plays? I already do, I said. When I was a young boy your age, said Mr. Bradbrook, I would memorize long passages and recite them whenever I was called upon to do so. When you read the master's lines, perhaps you too will be moved to memorize some. Perhaps one day you may even enact some. I already have, I said. Or perhaps Mrs. Baker will assign selected lines to you. Do you think that you might enjoy learning a line or two? He patted the top of my head, really. He reached out and patted the top of my head. Danny Hutford nearly fell out of his chair. He has already memorized quite a bit, said Mrs. Baker. Has he, said Mr. Bradbrook. He seemed sort of surprised. Well, let's hear some from the boy. Mrs. Baker looked down at me. I couldn't really tell what was in her eyes. I thought at first there might be a death threat, but either I'm getting used to them or that wasn't what was there. Hollinghood, do you know any lines or not? That was from Mr. Goreshi. And I almost said, you block, you stone, you worse than senseless thing to him. But whatever it was in Mrs. Baker's eyes, it told me that might not be the right thing to say. Probably a Caliban curse wouldn't work either, so I tried something else. This was the noblest Roman of them all the conspirators, save only he. Did that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only in a general, honest thought, and common good to all, made one of them. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. Merrily clapped. Even Doug Sweetuck clapped. I looked at Mrs. Baker's eyes. Azalea, she said quietly. What was that all about? Said Mr. Bradbrook. The power of goodness and honesty and faithfulness, said Mrs. Baker. Now if Mr. Goreshi will show you to your seats, the class will work through the day's lesson. She went up to the board. This is the sentence you'll be diagramming, she said to us all, and wrote it out. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. Then she turned to us. Who can identify the implied verb, she asked. For the next hour we did pretty well by Mrs. Baker.